evening.
Good evening.
Good evening, dear friends.
Good evening.
All right. And here we are at our fifth class of This Can Happen. And I want to make a few announcements, a few little announcements before we're going to jump in right now. So, announcement number one is that this summer, we're going to have our summer course. And I want to introduce you to our upcoming topic. And this is it. Take a look at this. Our summer course is called Judaism Decoded, the Origins and the Evolution of the Jewish Tradition. So this is you guys have no clue how excited I am to be doing this course. It's going to be really going back to everything about Judaism, everything we know about Jewish tradition, and questioning it. How do we know that our understanding, our interpretation is accurate? How do we know that? What's this whole idea of there being different traditions and customs, just really at the very heart of Jewish law? What does that mean that there's rabbis meddling in with law? Is it from God? How could we be sure it's from God? If Torah is divine, how could there be so many arguments and so many differences of opinions? So Judaism is really a science. It's the most rigorous religious system out there. There's a very beautiful system to the Jewish tradition. And this course is going to be in-depth, 6 lessons, going through how did we get from Sinai to the way Judaism looks like it does today. Answer some very important questions. How does a very old religious code deal with modern day questions, right? What happens if certain laws seem to go out of style? What happens if there's certain questions that arise that are not addressed in what we have? So it's really just understanding the system of Judaism. So that's this course called Judaism Decoded. It's starting in early July. It's going to start the week after July 4th. And again, we'll be in person and on Zoom. So stay tuned for the information about that. You'll be hearing more about that over the next couple of days and weeks. And I'm really excited. It's a good course. It's a good topic. It's one of the most fundamental topics. It's going to change your whole understanding of Judaism. You know, we hear these words sages say, and there's a Talmud, and there's a this. Just getting a very wholesome understanding of what is Judaism. What is the system of our religion? So that's for that. Let us jump into today's class. Lesson 5 of This Can Happen. We want to always thank our sponsor, Mrs. Leslie Gunsberg and Mrs. Faye Braverman, who sponsored this course in loving memory of Michael David Schramm of blessed memory, Leslie's son. And today is lesson 5, titled Out of the Blues. All right, so this is the agenda now. Over the last 4 classes, we've really gone into the soul of the purpose of creation, the destiny. And what we said was that was the soul, that was the very essence of what Mashiach, what the Messianic era, what the redemptive era represents. And now, with 2 classes remaining to our course, we're going to get back down a little bit more practical. Now that we understand what Mashiach represents and what's really behind it, we're going to look at the more practical side of the actual manifestation, right? The who, how, and when of the Messianic era actually happening and all that it entails. And let me see if I could find my notepad over here. I can't. Okay, so this is what we're going to be doing over today's class and next class. We want to touch upon, I can't find it. Okay. We want to touch upon, there are about 10 topics that we want to cover between today's class and next class, which is all about very practically, what's it going to look like? We're going to look at all the classical sources in Judaism to understand the following topics, such as what's the transition into the Messianic era? How is that going to go about? What's it going to look like? What's the transition going to be like? We're going to talk about the person. We haven't spoken about this yet. We believe there's going to be an individual. Mashiach is a person. There is a person, a leader who's going to usher us into the Messianic era. What's that all about? Who's this individual? We're going to be talking about the classical ideas of Mashiach coming, the ingathering of the exiles, all the Jews going to Israel, the rebuilding of the Holy Temple, the reinstatement of the supreme Jewish court, the Sanhedrin, Elijah the prophet, Jew and Gentile relationships in that era. We're really going to talk about all of these practical matters on a very practical level between today's class and next class. So God willing, we got a lot to cover over here. So let us begin in today's class with the very first step in exploring the practical side of Mashiach, which is what's it going to look like when it comes? What's that transition going to be like? And as we're going to see in a moment, it's not so clear what it's going to be like. You know, many times people have the perception that when we talk about a messianic era, you know, it could even happen today. Mashiach could come today. So it kind of sounds like, you know, you fall down this rabbit hole, and the next thing you know, you're in this fairyland. You know, it's in this fantasy land that you fall into. So is that what's going to happen, or is it going to be more of a natural progression of kind of the world's going to metamorphose into that era? So let us go through. I want to read 5 sources together with you. And these are classical sources. And we're just take a look at what is going to be the process of us entering into the Messianic era. So let's go around. We got a bunch of text to read. So Dr. Lieb, let's begin with you. Let's begin with text 1 on page 196. This is from the prophet Malachi. All right, you got to unmute, Doctor. All right. Dr. Lieb, you're up to text 1? All right, awesome.
Page 196?
Yes.
Oh, okay. The following text 1 to 5 appeared.
Start from where it says text 1, a sudden appearance.
Text 1. Behold, I will send my angel, and he will clear a way before me. And suddenly the God whom you seek will come to his temple.
All right, the key word over here, you tell me, what's the key word of this verse from Malachi that informs our conversation over here? It's the word suddenly. It says we have over here the idea that it's going to happen very suddenly. The commentaries understand this verse is referring to the Messianic era. And it says suddenly. In Hebrew, the word is upitom, pitom, which means all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it happens. So here we have a classical source for the idea that Mashiach's arrival happens very instantaneously. All right, let us do text 2. This is a fascinating text. Let's first read it, then I'll give you some background. David, would you like to read this text? Text 2, page 197.
Sure. When a mortal monarch plans to return to his home, it is typical protocol for his arrival to be announced in advance. An initial announcement may give notice that he will arrive in 10 days, followed perhaps by a second advisory 5 days in advance, and then 4 days until the final proclamation, the king is approaching the capital. The prophet Isaiah informed us that the Jewish redemption will not unfold in this manner. Rather, it will arrive in the blink of an eye. As he foretold, the first one in Sion, behold, here they are. And for Yerushalayim, I will give a herald. In other words, Yerushalayim's residents will not notice that all the tribes of Israel are converging on their city before the initial announcement is made by the first individual to reach Jerusalem, who will call out, look, here they all are, about to enter the city. It will be so sudden that the city's residents will not notice a thing before the reality materializes. The announcement and the event will come as one. Hence, the initial notice. For Jerusalem, I will give a herald, will be, behold, here they are.
So once again, we have this idea here in this text that insists that the arrival of Mashiach is going to happen in just a moment's notice, right? It's going to be a shock. All of a sudden, it's here, right? Behold, here they are. Nobody even realizes it's happening. You know, I got to tell you, this text is it comes from a book in the Jewish library called Magid Meisharim, authored by Rabbi Yosef Cairo. Anybody ever heard of this individual, Rabbi Yosef Cairo? Rabbi Yosef Cairo lived about 500 years ago. And he was one of the greatest modern, relatively modern sages. He authored what is known as the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. So really the modern source of Jewish law comes from him. He's the one that codified Jewish law. Until today, it's universal. Everybody follows Jewish law from the Shulchan Aruch. So he was a very, very unique individual, not just another rabbi, but somebody, a real pillar of within the Jewish history. But there's one of the books that he authored. He didn't even author it. It's a fascinating book. It's called Magid Mesharim. These are his personal notes they found only after he passed away. And these notes were from visitors from heaven. All right, you ready for this? He got nocturnal visitors. People would visit him at night, angels or prophets. And we know that this was something which happened to special spiritual Jews. They would get visited very often by different prophets of old, Elijah the prophet. And they would spend time studying with certain specific individual Jews, teaching them Torah from heaven. And Rabbi Yosef Cairo merited to have such visitors. I don't know if we know exactly who these visitors were, if it was which prophet it was, but he took down notes. They found it was never, he didn't write it for it to be published. It was meant to be personal notes, and it was diary entries. It had a date, and he would write down the teachings that he studied with a heavenly teacher. And this text comes from that book. So this is something which he studied from. Now, I just want to share this with you, that this was, I wouldn't say it was quite common, but for many, many very saintly special leaders and Torah scholars, this was somewhat common. The Holy Arizal, we know that Elijah the prophet studied with him for 8 years. 8 years. He would get a visit from Elijah the prophet on a nightly basis. And the Baal Shem Tov, we know, studied from a different prophet. His name was Achia Hashiloni, the prophet right before Elijah the prophet. He studied with him for 10 years. And there are many such cases, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, very special people who we could see they left a very special mark on the Jewish people. These weren't just Jewish leaders, there are lots of Jewish leaders, but really special individuals who changed the course of Jewish history and gave us a whole deeper understanding of studying and understanding. These people very often got special visits to learn Torah on a deeper level from a messenger from heaven. So in any case, back to this text. We see here from this text, again, we have this concept that's going to happen very suddenly. Okay, let us now read text 3. This is from the Zohar, of course, the ancient classic work of Jewish mysticism. Lori, would you like to read? Text 3, page 199.
Okay. When God will raise up the people of Israel and redeem them from this exile, he will open a small, thin ray of light for them. Thereafter, he will open another, far wider aperture. Finally, God will throw open the supernal gates that open to all 4 corners of the universe.
This text seems to imply the opposite, that it's going to be a gradual process. And this text says it's not going to happen instantaneously. It's going to happen slowly. First, a small, thin ray, right? And then eventually, God will throw open the gates. All right. The next text, text 4, page 200. Cindy, would you like to read? All right, Gail, how about you? You want to read, Gail? Text 4, page 200. Oh, Cindy, you're there? One second.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay, go ahead, Cindy.
Okay.
You do it.
The Jewish people of that generation will say, it is possible that the world functions as usual, and nevertheless, the redemption will arrive this year. However, they do not realize that Mashiach's arrival will be sudden.
All right. So here we see another classical text saying, and I like this text because it gives us permission to wonder, right? We all wonder this, right? The world looks like normal. The world looks like it's the same old crazy, chaotic place. And we're supposed to believe that redemption can happen this year, can happen this week, can happen today. So the sages say, we have to realize it's going to happen very suddenly. One moment it's not going to be, and all of a sudden next moment, the Messianic era is here. So again, we see another source for that the Messianic era is going to happen, that transition is going to happen very suddenly. All right, let's read one more text. Gail, all right, now go ahead. Text 5, page 201.
You want me to read or who you
Yes.
said? Okay,
Gail, yeah.
like the crack of dawn. Rabbi Akiva bar Abba and Rabbi Shimon ben Halatka once walked through the Arbel Valley and watched the break of dawn, whereupon Rabbi Akiva told Rabbi Shimon, so will be the Jewish redemption. It will begin with small steps, as it is stated, although I will sit in darkness, God will be a light to me. Then as it progresses, it will greatly swell and expand.
All right, so this was our last source over here. We're going to look at it over here. We see the other side again. It's going to be a process. It's going to happen slowly. It's going to be gradual. And this is something that the sages scratched their head on. And we looked at 5 sources. There are actually many more sources pointing to both options. There's one option that Mashiach is going to happen. Boom, it's going to be a thunderbolt, right? Out of the blue. It's here, just an instantaneous change. Somewhat miraculous, a supernatural change. And the other side of the coin is no, it's going to happen very slowly. It's going to be a gradual transformation, and it's going to be more natural, right? Natural, gradual, supernatural, suddenly, immediate. So which one is it? How is Mashiach going to come? Is it going to be natural and organic, or is it going to be a supernatural, miraculous occurrence? So the sages try understanding and deciphering what is the key to understanding this contradiction. And the sages look at a verse in Isaiah, and the sages of the Talmud say this is the key to understanding. How is Mashiach going to play out? Immediate, sudden, or gradual? Let's read this verse from Isaiah, text 6a on page 202. Elki, would you like to read?
The smallest will become 1,000, and the least a mighty nation. I am God, I will hasten it in its time.
All right. So right over here, this is one of Isaiah's prophecies about the Messianic era. And what Isaiah says, let's look at the last words. I will hasten it in its time. And the sages of the Talmud say that's a contradiction right there. I will hasten it means it's going to come before its time. In its time means it's coming in its time. There's no hastening it. So which one is it? Like I remember once when I was a kid. I once went to a magic show. And I remember I thought it was such a funny line when I heard it as a kid. The magician called up and wanted the kids to come up, and the kid was taking a while, to get to the stage. So the magician said, "It's okay, take your time, just hurry up." Right? Take your time, just hurry up. So which one is it, right? Is it taking its time or is it hurrying up, right? So is God going to hasten Mashiach's coming, or is it going to come at its time? And the sages say this is the key. Let's read the quote from the Talmud. Elki, read text 6b. Let's continue the understanding of this verse.
The same verse that states that the redemption will arrive in its time also states it will hasten it. I will hasten it. Is there a set time for the redemption or not? The Talmud resolves this seeming contradiction. If they merit, I will hasten it. If they do not merit, it will occur only when its time arrives.
All right. So this is a very important understanding of the time, the scheduling for Mashiach to come within the context of history. See, this is the way it works. As we've explored in some of the previous classes, we've done this in the first class, we've done this in last class as well, lesson 4. We do see that there's a certain storyline, there's a certain progression of history. And we do clearly see that, in fact, Mashiach coming is a process, it's a gradual process. In lesson 1, we saw that practically. We saw in lesson 1 that practically, for Mashiach to come, there's we see the world's becoming better. We spoke about the whole idea that we are right now in the Friday afternoon, the historical Friday afternoon. And that right now, historically, on the clock of history, we are currently in Friday afternoon, right? Rings a bell? You remember this, that concept we explored? And also in last class, we spoke about how there were these different eras and different frontiers throughout Jewish history we had to kind of accomplish. So we do see that there's a process, which means that when God planned history, planned time, there is a certain time when Mashiach has to come by then. We don't know exactly when it is. The Torah tells us, it's in scripture, that Jacob wanted to share with his children when the date Mashiach is going to come, and God immediately took away that knowledge from him. God didn't want him to share that. So we don't know exactly when the time is, but there is a deadline. And if by this time Mashiach does not come, if the Jews don't bring Mashiach on their own, it's going to have to happen by this time. So there is a process. At the same time, we have the hack to the system. We don't need to wait for Mashiach until that scheduled time arrives. Through doing mitzvahs and through doing more good, we have the opportunity to rush through that schedule, and Mashiach can come at any given moment. Which is why, if you think about it, 1,000 years ago, Jews believed that Mashiach could come, that year. So one could ask a question based on what we've learned in this course. Rabbi, if we learned that we're only in Friday afternoon, right now in the current modern times, then how could Jews believe in Mashiach 1,000 years ago? And the idea is Mashiach, we have that kind of escape hatch. We have that key that could bring Mashiach at any given moment. So the point is, which one is it? Does Mashiach come gradually, naturally, organically, or does it happen suddenly? And the answer is kind of both. There's always a progression. But then whenever the moment is where we reach that goal that we need to bring Mashiach, it happens at that moment. So it's always gradual up until it comes, but it's always going to be that last moment of him coming is always going to be somewhat of a shock. It's always going to catch us off guard, which I think makes sense. No matter how much we study, and we do study, and we do see that the world is really marching, especially in the most recent years and decades. We definitely see that the world is marching towards the messianic world, the messianic vision. I'm saying this is kind of, the more you study about it, the harder it is to refute that. It's really an amazing, it's astounding that the world is really getting closer to that goal. And you can even see it very practically. But nonetheless, when Mashiach comes, there's no question it's going to be a shock. There's no question it's going to be somewhat of a sudden surprise. And that's the idea. It's a little bit of both. It's a healthy attitude that on the one hand, throughout history, there is a progression. On the other hand, it can come suddenly. So that's on the topic of the transition. Now, when it's actually time for Mashiach to come. Mashiach is a new era. The world's going to enter a new phase, what we call the Messianic era or the era of redemption. But in Judaism, there's a very strong idea that there is a human involved. There's always a human. Mashiach can only come with a human. There is a person, Mashiach. There's a person. There is a Messiah. Who's the Messiah? That's what we're going to try to discover. Let's take a look at this. I just want to point this out to you. It's in your books also. It's on page 205 if you want to take a look at it. This is this is from a pretty old Haggadah, printed in the year 1560. And like all Haggadahs, there's some nice pictures and illustrations. So here in this Haggadah, which is very traditional for Haggadahs to have, there's a depiction, and I'll zoom in to the bottom. There is a depiction of Mashiach coming. You see, Mashiach is arriving on a donkey. We'll talk about that in a moment. It's very interesting. Isaiah speaks about Mashiach coming on a donkey, riding on a donkey. But there's another individual right behind Mashiach. There's someone blowing a shofar. And this is the idea in Jewish tradition that besides there being a Mashiach, even before Mashiach comes, Elijah the prophet's going to come to announce that Mashiach's coming. Let's take a look at this on page 203, text 7. Alan, would you like to read? This is from the prophet Malachi as well.
Sure. This is a short one.
I'll give you another one.
Okay. I will send Elijah the prophet to you before the arrival of the day of God.
All right, that's very interesting. I'll just share with you. Malachi was the last prophet. There was a very specific date, a cutoff date, when the era of prophecy ended. Ever since then, there were no more prophets. So for hundreds of years, Jews enjoyed having prophets, many, many prophets. And they would regularly communicate messages from God. It was a very, I can only imagine, it must have been a very awe-inspiring thing to have a human being who was regularly receiving messages from God. I'm saying Malachi was the last one. This is the very last prophecy that Malachi shared. So I think there's a certain symbolism, there's certain significance in the fact that this is the last prophecy of the last prophet. This is the last prophecy Jews ever heard. That before Mashiach comes, Elijah the prophet's coming before the day of God. So right before Mashiach comes, Elijah's going to come. So let's talk a little bit about Elijah the prophet and what's he doing before Mashiach comes. So Elijah the prophet is one of the most beloved prophets, right? We all know Elijah the prophet. Like Habakkuk the prophet doesn't get any attention for some reason, right? You ever heard of a Habakkuk? He was a great prophet, but for some reason, Elijah is a special prophet. And he was a prophet in northern Israel in the 8th century before the Common Era. He was very, very unique because, if I'm not mistaken, he's the only individual that we have any record of in Jewish sources who did not die. Elijah never died. He went up to heaven with his body. People witnessed this. A chariot of fire descended from the heavens. He went into this chariot and he went up to heaven. It was like, it's like an unbelievable thing, which means that's what happens to all of us. Our souls go back up to heaven, but most of us can't bring our bodies along with us, which is what happens, right? The soul disconnects from the body and our souls go up to heaven. He was the one individual that was able to bring his body along with him. For that reason, that's the reason why Elijah is the one who gets dispatched many times from heaven to visit earth again, because he has a body. So, it makes sense that he should come back to visit earth if he's got the tools to visit earth, right? He already has that spaceship, he already has the spacesuit. So in any case, Elijah is going to come back down. And just by the way, that's why Elijah was the prophet who many times visited whenever there had to be a heavenly messenger from heaven to a human being down here on earth. Usually it was Elijah doing that because, Elijah kind of has that flexibility where on the one hand, he's got the bodies, he could visit earth, right? He can go back and forth. And before Mashiach comes, Elijah is going to come. He's coming before. What's he coming for? Now, Elijah has a bunch of jobs to do right before Mashiach comes and at the very beginning of the Messianic era. You'll see it in your books on page 204, and I'll put it up here on the screen as well. These are Elijah's jobs. Elijah will, number one, announce Mashiach's imminent arrival. That's number one. There's this idea that Mashiach, somebody has to announce that he's coming. Now, I tried doing some research into why is that so necessary? Why can't Mashiach just show up? He needs someone else to come announce he's coming. And, the simple reason is because that's how it works with any important person, any diplomat, right? Like we just had our Secretary of State went to visit Israel, right? So he didn't just show up. They put out an announcement. Secretary Blinken is going to Israel. Make sure to visit him at the airport, right? That's how diplomats travel. You announce it. You make sure that people are ready for you. So there's this idea that before Mashiach comes, Elijah is going to give us the first warning that he's indeed coming. Role number two, he's going to inspire the Jewish people to better their ways and prepare their hearts for the redemption. Now, we don't know if this means he's literally going to show up and inspire us, or if it's going to be more of like a spirit. He'll bring a certain inspiration and awareness somehow that's going to inspire all of us right before Mashiach comes. That's the third one. That's the second one. Job number three of Elijah, he's going to restore prophecy. As I mentioned, over 2,000 years ago, prophecy ended. The era of prophecies ended, and he's going to be the one to kind of bring back prophecy to this world. and 2 more jobs. He's going to answer unresolved halachic queries. All right, this is a very interesting one. Jewish law, we all have Jewish law, right? But the more you study Jewish law, you realize that, and we're going to be talking a lot about this in the next course. The way Jewish law was designed by God is that God gave us the tools to figure things out. Which means if you look at the Torah and you look at the information that Moses received on Mount Sinai, that was actually limited. And a lot of the rest of it, God wanted us to figure out on our own, which is indeed what's happening in the Talmud. Don't worry, we got a whole hour-and-a-half class just to explain what that even means. What does that even mean, that there's a human role in uncovering what is divine law? That seems weird, right? There's a human role in creating divine law. Is it human or is it divine? That's the idea. And in the Talmud, there's a lot of figuring out, what is the law in certain cases, especially when there are contradictions. I'll give you an example of a contradiction. You want to know what a contradiction in Jewish law is? According to Jewish tradition, when a baby boy is 8 days old, he gets a circumcision, right? The Brit Milah. But there's another law in Judaism that you're not allowed to do any surgeries unless it's life-threatening on Shabbat. So what happens if a baby is born on Shabbos, like I was, and 8 days later, when's the bris? On Shabbos. So there you got Jewish law having a contradiction. Jewish law says on the 8th day you need to give the circumcision, and Jewish law also says on the 8th day you can't do it. So which one is it? So that's where the Talmud comes in. So Torah is full of these contradictions where we have to figure things out. And okay, many times in the Talmud, they try figuring certain things out, figuring out contradictions, trying to understand how to apply law, and they come to a dead end. So the Talmud, and if you study just a few pages of Talmud, you start seeing this quite regularly. The Talmud concludes, anytime they can't resolve an answer, they say, teku. That's the word, teku. Teku means checkmate. No, teku means let the question stand. It means we don't know the answer, there's no answer. But the sages give us an interesting insight. They say the word teku, I wish I would have made a slide for this. Teku is actually an abbreviation. There's 4 letters in the word teku, and it stands for a full sentence. Tishbi gitaretz kushiot v'ibayot. Elijah the prophet will answer all the questions. Which means any questions that the sages weren't able to figure out, when Elijah comes, he'll tell us the answer. So you'll be surprised. You will actually be very surprised how much of Jewish law is still waiting in limbo. There's a lot of things we don't have a full understanding of, and Elijah is going to be the one to come and tell that to us. Now, why Elijah? Because Elijah was only 3rd generation from Moses. Elijah's teacher, which was the previous prophet, his name was Achia Hashiloni. All right, that's a prophet right before Elijah. Achia Hashiloni learned under Moses. He was there in the desert. He was a little boy when they left Egypt. He was a little boy at the giving of the Torah, which means Elijah the prophet is only kind of 1 generation off going back to Moses. And again, there's a certain transparency in Judaism. There were laws that we forgot. And that's part of it. We forgot certain details. And we're going to be talking all about it in the next course. It's quite fascinating, the entire evolution of Jewish tradition. But there's no question that when the Talmud was being discussed and written 1,300 years, more 1,500 years after the giving of the Torah, we lost certain information. And we're actually very transparent about that. There are areas of Jewish law we don't know. We lost the information, presumably. And the Talmud tells us clearly, we don't know the answer. It was forgotten. It was very common. Not very, but it was somewhat common. Elijah, being only a 2nd generation after the giving of the Torah, is going to be in a much better position to give us the authentic answers back from Sinai, back from Moses. And that's what he's going to do. He's going to answer unresolved halachic questions in preparing us for the Messianic era, when Jewish law is going to be in its much fuller sense. We'll be talking about that next week. And number 5, the role of Elijah is going to be to restore the Sanhedrin. Restore the Sanhedrin. Let me give you a little bit of background for this also. the Sanhedrin was the ancient Supreme Court, which was in Jerusalem. And they were the final say in Jewish law. So just like here in our country, there are many, right? There's all the smaller courts and the local courts and the circuit courts. And then, right, you make your way up to federal, and then there's a Supreme Court. The same thing happened with Jewish law in Israel. Anytime there was a lack of clarity, anytime there had to be a law being made, ultimately the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court, had the final say. The Supreme Court had 71 justices, right? Talk about court packing. Quite a lot of justices. It didn't work like our Supreme Court, but there were 71 rabbis. Now, in order to be a member of the Sanhedrin, by the way, fun fact, Mordechai from the Purim story was a member of the Sanhedrin, right? Okay. Now, what do your qualifications have to be? What has to be on your resume to be on the Sanhedrin? It's not enough if you were a smart rabbi. You had to have what is called smicha. Have you ever heard of that term, smicha? Now, smicha is basically called rabbinic ordination. So I'll tell you what the modern rabbinic ordination is. Modern rabbinic ordination is you study. It takes about a year to a year and a half in the modern age. You have to study certain sections of Jewish law. And then somebody tests you, a rabbi tests you, and gives you a certificate saying, okay, you got smicha, you are now rabbinically ordained. Now, that is not real smicha. That is not real smicha. You learn and get a test, and now you become, right? You become like a baseline rabbi, right? You get your basic degree, right? Original smicha, the way God designed it to be, was that you had to be personally chosen by somebody to give to you, to confer to you smicha, and it had to be a direct line from Moses. So smicha was not just getting a test. Actually, there was no test involved. Smicha literally means to lean your hands, to put your weight on something. Moses was the first one to do it. Moses gave smicha to Joshua. And now Joshua is the one who received, he is not just a rabbi. He's a figure that goes back to Moses. And Joshua gave it to more people. And only if you got smicha and you could track your smicha back to Moses, only then is your smicha real smicha. And only then could you really serve on a Jewish Supreme Court. So no matter how smart I am, I cannot be on the Sanhedrin when it happens again, because I never got smicha that could be traced back to Moses. Now, the way it works is, in the 2nd century, that was when smicha ended. Ever since then, you cannot get smicha anymore. We actually once did a full hour-and-a-half class on this in the Great Debates in Jewish History course. Elke, you were there, right? We did a whole class on smicha and the whole history. It's a fascinating history. But the point is, it was disbanded, and right now it does not exist. You cannot get that anymore, which means we got a problem. When Mashiach comes, the Sanhedrin is going to be reinstated. There's only one problem. Nobody's alive today who could be on the Sanhedrin. Why not? Because nobody has smicha. So one of the things that Elijah is going to do is he got smicha from Achia Hashiloni, his teacher, and Achia Hashiloni, right? He's right there in the chain. Achia maybe got it from Joshua. I don't know what. I don't know exactly who in the line. But so Elijah is going to be the one to kind of bring us back and restart that process of giving smicha. And it's like that there could be justices on the different courts, on the different beit dins. So this is the job of Elijah. He has a bunch of jobs to do. These 5 jobs is what Elijah is going to be doing when he comes. All right. That's for Elijah. And then let's move on to the next human. The next human is Mashiach. Elijah introduces Mashiach. I want to show you again the painting of the Haggadah. All right, we'll zoom in again. And we see over here that the way Mashiach is depicted is riding a donkey. Now, this comes from a verse from Isaiah, I believe. Isaiah describes Mashiach riding a donkey. He arrives on a donkey, which is a bit interesting, you know. But that's his choice of travel, right? Shouldn't it be a limo? Something a little bit more impressive, right? A donkey. You see, I'll actually share with you something interesting. I'll point out something interesting. You know, right now is not the time to get too into this, but there's a very interesting symbolism over here. There are 3 donkeys in the Torah. There are more than 3 donkeys in the Torah, but 3 associated with Jewish leaders. Abraham has a donkey. The Torah tells us that when Abraham was going to sacrifice his son, Isaac, right? The famous story of the binding of Isaac, when God tested Abraham. The Torah tells us Abraham took a donkey, he put his tools on it, he put his utensils on it, and they travel with a donkey. It's one donkey, Abraham with a donkey. Moses, when Moses begins his leadership of the Jewish people at the age of 80, he travels from Midian to Egypt with his wife and children. This is when he's going to Egypt to meet the Jewish people and denounce his leadership and begin the process of leading the Jewish people. The Torah tells us he traveled with donkeys. He put his wife and kids on a donkey. All right, again, there's a donkey with a Jewish leader. And then Mashiach is going to arrive on a donkey. So 3 of the most important Jewish leaders, the 3 Jewish leaders who began an era. Abraham began an era. He wasn't just another Jewish leader. He was a revolutionary leader. He began something. He began a movement. So Abraham begins a new era. He has a donkey. Moses begins a new era, right? The very founding of the Jewish people, the building of the temples, of the tabernacle. He rides on a donkey. And Mashiach also has a donkey. So there's a lot of symbolism there, but I'll leave it at that. What the symbolism is for another time. But it's very interesting that this idea. So in Jewish tradition, let's really try to understand practically who is the human Mashiach? Who is this person? And let's get past all the misconceptions and let's really understand what does Judaism have to say about Mashiach? Who is he? What's he going to look like? What are his qualities? And most importantly, how do we identify Mashiach? Right? If somebody shows up and says, I'm Mashiach, do we believe him? Do we not believe him? What do we do? This is a very practical question because this happened many times throughout Jewish history. There were rumors where people actually said, I'm Mashiach. You know, like, how do we know? So on a very practical level, who is Mashiach and how do we identify him? This is the way it works. There is no messianic era without the person. There needs to be an individual. Judaism calls him Melech HaMashiach, the King Messiah. There's going to be a human being who's going to be a leader, and he's going to be the one to take us out of the era of exile and into the era of redemption. Now, you could wonder, I think it's a valid question. That's outdated. Kings, who needs a king? Right? We need a King Mashiach. In general, why do we need a leader? Why do we need a person? Why can't we just collectively, as a Jewish people, enter a new era? Right now that we'll enter an era of world peace. We need a human. So I just want to share with you a quick thought on this. The idea of needing a human, even a monarch, a king, a real leader, which Judaism really sees the value of leadership, of having people, a somebody who leads and even has a king, even has that type of influence of a king. We even look at Moses and call him a king. Even Moses is a king. He had a certain, he wasn't just a leader. He wasn't just an influential person. He was a strong leader. God didn't just take us out of Egypt. Okay, yeah, here I'm God, all Jews come follow me, right? It was a human leader, The same thing, throughout all of Jewish history, there's King David, Mordechai in the Purim story. We didn't just have the Jewish people kind of figuring things out together. We always had a leader. And the real truth is, you could say that's human nature. If you look back at every single revolution throughout all of human history, good and the bad, there's always a leader. There's always somebody who began the revolution, who was the influencer, the inspirer behind the revolution. But more importantly, Judaism sees a very strong value in having one human, one leader, even a king who unifies the people. You see, we live in a, Winston Churchill famously said about democracy, that democracy is the worst form of governance besides all the other options, right? Right? It's the worst, but at least it's better than the rest of all the other ones. And there was idea. What's the problem with democracy? So first, let's talk about what's good about democracy. The good thing about democracy is, right, too much power, right? Complete power equals complete corruption, right? That's the way it works. So when you had kings and you had a monarchy that was full of corruption, and it became a totalitarian regime, an authoritarian regime, because you just have one person who's calling all the shots, and they become corrupt. Power corrupts, which is why the world slowly evolved. We don't have any monarchy, and now more or less we believe in democracy. But what's the problem with democracy, right? We live in a democracy, in a republic democracy, a democratic republic, right? And what's the idea? The problem with democracies is it's essentially a leaderless people. There's no leaders. The leaders are really followers. All of our elected officials are actually followers. They're trying to get our vote. They're following us. They're not real leaders. Which that's a problem. When people don't have a leadership in Judaism, it's seen as a deficiency, because then there's nothing unifying. You need a unifying force that inspires everybody and helps everybody rise above their individual self and enter a certain unified self. Not just a collective, but a unity where we all can lift each other up with a higher vision. And that happens with a king, with a leader. Moses did that to us. He lifted us up as one unit. The Torah describes that when we stood at Mount Sinai, there were 3 million people there approximately. The Torah says we stood there like one person, beating with one heart. There was this tremendous unity. We were so deeply connected at that moment under the leadership of Moses. And Judaism says that can only happen when there's an individual who's leading the people. You need a leader. And that's going to be the role of Mashiach. Mashiach is going to be, just think a little bit in your mind about any Jewish leader. Think about Moses, think about King David, think about Mordechai. These were tremendous, beautiful leaders who cared deeply about the people and inspired the people, especially in times of peril, really helped uplift the people, the Baal Shem Tov. You think about these amazing leaders. That's going to be Mashiach, the quintessential Jewish leader, a human of flesh and blood, but is gifted by God with a tremendous, deep and sensitive soul, who's able to really bring the Jewish people together, inspire them, and bring the world to a new era, just like many Jewish leaders have in the past. So that's the idea, that there's going to be one individual, even a monarch, a real strong, powerful Jewish leader. And let's learn a little bit about his personality, about who this Mashiach is. Debbie, let's read text 8. Would you like to read? Text 8 on page 206.
Text 8. King Mashiach will certainly be a righteous human, born of a man and a woman.
All right. It's going to be a human, no angels, no nothing. There's going to be a human being, just like all of us, presumably alive today. We'll talk about that in a moment. There's somebody out there who's a potential Mashiach, and that's who it is. But let's talk a little bit about the personality and the qualities of this Mashiach. So Debbie, would you like to read text 9 as well? Because that was a short text. Text 9 from the sages in the Midrash.
Behold, my servant will succeed. He will be exalted and elevated, and he will reach tremendous heights. This is a reference to the King Mashiach, who will be exalted over Abraham, elevated higher than Moses, and he will reach tremendous heights, greater than the angels.
All right. So a very great leader, the greatest leader that ever was, right? Quite the resume. Let's read another text from Maimonides, where Maimonides kind of describes a little bit more who the Messiah is. So Pam, would you like to read? Text 10, page 208.
Okay. The King Mashiach, who will arise from David's descendants, will be wiser than Solomon and a great prophet close to the level of Moses. He will therefore teach the entire nation and instruct them in the path of God, and all the nations will come to hear his words.
All right, so a very tremendous leader. He's going to be a teacher. So that's a very big part of here. We see Mashiach's going to be a teacher, which is, again, fits the bill of Jewish leadership. Jewish leaders were teachers. They taught us Torah. They inspired us. But Maimonides also says he's going to be a universal figure. All the nations will come to hear his words. By the way, let me digress for a moment. 100 years ago, you read this Maimonides. It sounds a little bit crazy. Meaning it doesn't sound natural. How could one human individual be teaching an entire nation and the whole world is under his influence? You know, he has such a power. He has such an influence, the whole world. Today, we don't have that question anymore. Mashiach can have his own Twitter handle, his own YouTube feed. You'll be able, I'm saying the whole world will be able to tap into, you know, we live in a world which is a lot more conducive, a lot more, right, for a lot of these ideas, what we believe in. Okay. Now, Joel's asking a good question here in the chat. Why not to the level of Moses? Right? This text says greater than Solomon, great, right? But almost as good as Moses. Joel, I got even a better question for you. If any of you were paying good attention, if you look back at text 9, it says elevated higher than Moses. Text 9 says he's greater than Moses. Text 10, Maimonides says he's not as great as Moses. Which one is it? Okay, so the Torah says clearly, the Torah says, never again will there arise a prophet as great as Moses. So Mashiach is not going to be as great of a prophet as Moses, but he's going to be a greater leader than Moses. The Torah clearly says the Jewish people will never have a prophet greater than Moses, but okay. But in the Messianic, okay, let us read now text 11. Let's add another quality to Mashiach's resume. Beth, would you like to read text 11, page 209?
Mashiach's uniqueness will be his humility. Despite reaching the pinnacle of greatness, due to which he will teach Torah to the patriarchs and to Moses, he will nevertheless achieve the ultimate in humility and self-nullification, due to which he will also teach the simplest folk.
All right. So the next thing is Mashiach's going to be very humble, a lot of humility, which is, again, if you look back at the great Jewish leaders throughout the ages, that's another quality you see. The real authentic Jewish leaders had tremendous humility. They were forceful leaders, but in a very humble way. They never had an ego. They were never arrogant. And that's Mashiach. He's going to be very humble. He's going to be able to relate to every single Jew. When Mashiach comes, the patriarchs are going to return. Moses is going to return. And even they are going to learn from Mashiach. Even they're going to need to listen to Mashiach's wisdom. And Mashiach is still going to find the time and the patience and the tools to even relate to the most simple Jews. Usually professors can't talk to little kids, right? Usually people have their demographics that they could address, you know? If somebody's a preschool teacher, they know how to talk to preschoolers. They don't know how to talk to adults. If somebody's a college professor, I don't know how to speak to 5-year-olds. Mashiach's going to have the ability to relate to every single person on their own level. All right, this is the idea. Now you go a lot deeper spiritually, mystically, and we're not going to get into it. Text 12 gets into it. I just think it's just text 12 is real cognitive overload. All right. So if you want, you can read text 12 on your own and try understanding it. Not now. It's but you could go even deeper into the type of soul that Mashiach has. What's the idea? Mashiach's going to be the real quintessential Jewish leader. Now here's the real question. How are we going to know who is Mashiach when he shows up? How are we going to know? Right. Well, the real Messiah, please stand up. Right? People have always wondered this. And as I mentioned, there have been many cases in history where people have made assumptions and even people came straight out saying, I am Mashiach, I'm not Mashiach, he's Mashiach. How do we know? Now, in Judaism, we do not have to guess if somebody is the real deal or not. There's no guessing. we have Jewish law. Jewish law lays out a very rigid, very defined system, how to identify if somebody is real. It has nothing to do with how impressive he seems to be, nothing to do with if he could do miracles. Jewish law clearly says we couldn't care less if he could do miracles or could not do miracles. The point is not that he has to impress us, not about being charismatic. There are specific identifying features. If this person matches that, he's Mashiach. If not, he's not Mashiach. Simple as that. You should know following this criteria saved us from a lot of trouble throughout history. The times in Jewish history when we did not follow these guidelines, it brought devastating results, which we'll soon explore some historical attempts at identifying Mashiach. So let us learn from Jewish law, the way Maimonides codifies it. How do we identify who is Mashiach? Alan, would you like to read? Text 14 on page 214.
Sure. Identifying features. When a king from the house of David will arise, who, like his ancestor David, diligently studies the Torah and observes its mitzvot as prescribed by the written law and the oral law, influences all of Israel to walk in the way of the Torah, rectifies the breaches in its observance, and wages God's battles, this person is presumed to the Mashiach. If he succeeds in the above and he builds the temple in its place and gathers the dispersed of Israel, he is certainly the Mashiach.
All right, so Jewish law gives us actually two stages in identifying Mashiach. There's a presumed Mashiach, which means we can assume or presume that this person is Mashiach, but we don't know if he's actually the real deal yet, but we can start making a certain assumption. And then there's the confirmed Mashiach when we know for sure. So here's the criteria as Maimonides laid it out. It's in your books on page 215. I'll also share it here on the screen. So this is Mashiach's deal. Number one, this is always number one. The conversation doesn't even begin if he's not a descendant of King David. Mashiach needs to be a descendant from King David, not just a descendant, but son after son. It has to be a male lineage. God promised King David that he's always going to have the monarchy of the Jewish people. And ever since then, there was never allowed to be a king which was not from King David, from that dynasty. That's the first thing. All right, and that's why you should know, it was actually just an interesting thing. Many families kept a record of their family records. Many families have family trees. In my family, we have a family tree, not through my father, through my mother, that we come from King David. We could trace ourselves back. We know exactly every single person in between from King David until myself. So it's a pretty cool thing to have that. Well, basically, I'll tell you, you don't have to go that far back. The family tree that we have takes us back to the Maharal of Prague, who was a 16th century great rabbi. And he's like a famous stop in the road. Like, that's like, once you trace yourself back to him, then that's already very easy to trace yourself back to King David. But so in my family, we have an exact person. Which of the Maharal's sons? Rabbi Yehuda Lowy, who was the rabbi of Prague, the creator of the Golem. You ever heard of that? The legend of the Golem? So he's the creator of the Golem. And I'm a descendant of his, but I'm not son after son. It stops by my grandmother. So my mother's father is son after son from King David. So maybe he could have been Mashiach. No, I'm just kidding. But at least for this one criteria, that's the first thing you got to know, that you come from King David. Okay, that's the first one. Number two, Mashiach has to be supremely pious and well-versed in Torah. Or, really a righteous person, just a really righteous person. Number three, influence the Jewish nation to follow the ways of the Torah. Mashiach has to be an influential figure. Has to be somebody out there who's inspiring Jews and strengthening Jews' faith and Jews' commitment. And number four, Mashiach has to wage God's battles. All right, now this is vague. What does that mean? Wage God's battles? What battles? So we don't know exactly. I got to tell you, a lot about the era of Mashiach we still don't know fully. We don't have full clarity on everything. But many commentaries understand this idea of waging God's battles as being not a battle of swords, right? Not a battle on the battlefield, but a battle of ideas, a battle of values. Mashiach is going to, so to speak, elevate the world, but you got to fight the status quo. Sometimes you have to fight with values and words, a battle of words, a battle of ideas, to help people realize a deeper way of thinking and a deeper way, a deeper way of being. Now, if there's somebody who checks off these 4 checkboxes, we can assume that he is Mashiach. Now, doesn't mean he is Mashiach, but we have the license by Jewish law to openly say this guy looks good. The jury is still out if he's going to end up being the real deal. That we don't know yet. But he is a potential. So we are able to identify potential Mashiachs. But then, if you want to know if he's the real deal, there's 2 more steps he has to do. Which is, again, right, it's in your books right after this. The confirmed Mashiach must, number 1, ingather the Jewish people, which means bring the Jewish people back to Israel, and B, build the 3rd holy temple. Right. This work gets a little bit more difficult for Mashiach, right? So if there's no 3rd temple built, and if there's no ingathering of the Jewish people, then we don't know if he's Mashiach yet. But once Mashiach accomplishes these 2 things, we know he's the real deal. Until that point, he could be a great Jewish leader. But we don't know for a fact that you're Mashiach until you build the Holy Temple and bring the Jewish people together. Okay. Now, here's the way it works. According to Jewish tradition, every single generation has what's called a potential Mashiach waiting in the wings. The way God created reality is that at every given moment, Mashiach has to be ready. There has to always be a human Mashiach available. And for that reason, from the moment the Holy Temple was destroyed up until now, Jewish tradition insists that at every single time there was a soul that was brought down here on earth that's living, and they are the potential Mashiach if the cards, right, if the stars are all aligned and it's time for Mashiach to come. Let's read this in text 16 on page 218. Michelle, would you like to read? You got to unmute, Michelle.
Sorry.
There you go. Perfect.
In every generation, a descendant of Judah is born who is a befitting candidate to be the Jewish Mashiach.
That's the idea. We have to safely assume that today, right now, there's a living, breathing person, alive, available, and possesses, the physical and spiritual qualities for this job. Now, here's the famous question. Does the potential Mashiach know that he's Mashiach? And the answer is no, not necessarily. Moses was born to be a Jewish leader, but he didn't know it until he was 80 years old. 80 years old. Moses had no clue that he has, this leadership position waiting for him until he stumbled upon God at the burning bush. And then God said, Moses, you're the leader. You got to take the Jewish people out of Egypt. So the same thing is, we have to assume that there's a Mashiach alive, but it's also very safe to assume that the Mashiach doesn't even know he's Mashiach, which is quite fascinating. When it's time for him to kind of enter that role, God is going to reveal that information to him. However, God does it. The Moses we know is at a burning bush. And that is when this person is going to begin his role as a Jewish leader as Mashiach. But the point is, in every generation, there was somebody. And for this reason, because it was always a somebody, it made sense, and it was somewhat common for people to look at their generation's leadership and try to identify who's the potential Mashiach of our generation. And this is something that the Talmud tells us people did in the times of the Talmud. People looked at different sages and different rabbis and said, this guy looks like he could be the Mashiach if Mashiach is coming in our generation. So it's a fascinating piece of Talmud. Let's read text 17 on page 219. Sharon, would you like to read? Okay. Oh, Sharon, you got to unmute. It didn't go. There you go.
What is the Mashiach's name? The scholars of Rabbi Shiloh's academy would say his name is Shiloh, as it is stated. The scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes, and all the nations will rally to him.
I'm going.
Oh, okay. The scholars of Rabbi Yanni's academy would say his name is Yanan, as it is stated. May his name endure forever. For as long as the sun, may his name continue. Yan. The scholars of Rabbi Kanana's academy would say his name is Kanana, as it is stated. For during your exile, I will show you no favor, Kahana. Some scholars insist that his name is Menachem, the son of Shijaki, as it is stated, because at the time of destruction, the comforter Menachem that should relieve my soul is far from me. Rabbi Nachman stated, if the Messiah is among the living, he is a person who already occupies a government position, such as me. As it is stated, their prince shall be of themselves, and their governor shall proceed from their midst. Rav stated, if the Messiah is among those currently alive, he is the holy Rabbi Yehuda, the prince. If the Messiah is among the dead, he is Daniel, the beloved.
So we see this idea of finger pointing historically and trying to who is it? Is maybe this guy, this leader, that leader? Let's read this next text, text 18 on page 221. Alex, would you like to read? This is already a more contemporary text.
I would be delighted.
Wonderful. 221, page 221.
In each generation, people would assume that a particular individual was the Mashiach, if the redemption were to occur at that time. In his generation, it was declared and accepted that Rabbi Judah, the prince, was a suitable candidate to serve as a Mashiach. Similarly, the students of Rabbi Itzhak Luria, the Arizal, wrote that he was the Mashiach of that generation. All this is straightforward matter.
So we really see throughout history people looking to their teachers, to the great Jewish leaders of the time. I've also seen being written about Maimonides. People thought that Maimonides was going to be the Mashiach of his generation because, right, Maimonides checked off all the boxes in his times. So it was a very good assumption that this is maybe who it is. So this is another idea that there's a Mashiach waiting in every single generation. Either he knows it or he doesn't know it, but there's definitely somebody capable who's alive right now who could do it. And that, in Jewish history, we did not shun from speculating who it maybe could have been. It's not a secret that people, especially followers of the Rebbe, looked at the Rebbe and speculated maybe he's the Mashiach of our generation. And, who knows? That's in every generation. That was a very normal, standard thing for people to do. But it's nothing more than that. It's just speculation, right? Nobody really knows until he actually shows up. Actually, once there's a story. My great-great-grandfather was what's called the pre-war Rebbe's of Europe. So there are a lot of Hasidic groups. Most of these Hasidic circles were decimated in the times of the Holocaust. But my great-great-grandfather was a holy Jew. His name was the Kapizhnitzer Rebbe, and he led a Hasidic court. He was a leader of his community of a few thousand Jews. So they say a story about him that once somebody came and asked him about somebody if he's Mashiach. So a Jew showed up to Kapizhnitzer Rebbe and said, is this other Jew, could he be Mashiach? So the Kapizhnitzer Rebbe, my great-great-grandfather, answered to him. He told him, look, I know I'm not Elijah the prophet. You know that you're not Elijah the prophet. Jewish tradition tells us that Elijah the prophet can tell us who Mashiach is. Let's just wait for him. So the idea is, right, so We could speculate who Mashiach is, who Mashiach isn't, but at the end of the day, it's just speculation. But we're allowed to assume. We have the permission to assume, and even to throw our support behind somebody as a Mashiach if they check off all the boxes. Okay, but here's the very important thing, and I think this is very, very important if we're going to learn about the concept of the Messianic era and the person Mashiach. There is no redemption. The redemptive era does not begin until there's a human Mashiach. Period. There needs to be a human that brings us into that era. Just like Moses showed up as a human and then took us out of Egypt, there needs to be a human that takes us out of the state of exile and brings us to the era of redemption. To prematurely declare Messiah has arrived, we have already entered the era of redemption, is simply, that's not legitimate. Jewish law tells us there's a very specific process how it happens. And, any attempt historically to declare prematurely that redemption has started usually had catastrophic results because it wasn't true, and it built up false hope. That's just not the way it is. The era of Mashiach does not happen until there is a person Mashiach, and only with that person Mashiach do we enter that new phase. We could say that we could look at history and say that we are in the era of preparation. We could say the world is preparing for Mashiach, and we've done that so far in this course. We see that the world is getting closer to that era, but we cannot say that we entered that era already. A little analogy is you think about a marriage. So there are a lot of steps in preparing for marriage. There's courtship, there's engagement, then you throw the bridal shower, and then there's a wedding ceremony, and then you sign the contract, you sign the papers, but they're not husband and wife yet. There's a very one specific definable moment that makes a couple husband and wife. In Jewish law, that's the moment that the husband, the groom, slides the ring down the finger of the bride. Until that moment, they're not husband and wife. Yeah, we're preparing for it with it, but it didn't happen yet. So too with Mashiach, and I want to make this very clear because historically there have been attempts to say, oh, Mashiach is already here. It already started. Without the human Mashiach, Mashiach is not here. You could say we're preparing for it. That's fine, but not that it started yet. And again, historically, it never turned out good when there was that lack of clarity. The era only begins when there's a person. I want to conclude today's class by looking at two historical attempts at identifying Mashiach. There have been many historical attempts at pinning hopes on a person that this person is going to be the Mashiach. Some better known, some less known. But we're going to talk about two such examples and what we can learn from these examples as we close today's class. Two cases of campaigns, messianic campaigns around the person as being Mashiach. One is an individual named Bar Kokhba, and the second one, his name is Shabtai Tzvi. Two rather famous cases. We'll go through the stories a little bit. Now, spoiler alert, neither of them turned out to be the Mashiach. The proof is we're still here. But these are two very different cases. Let's contrast them. So let's begin with Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba, whose real name was actually Bar Koziba, was a figure in the times of the Talmud in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and he led a campaign, a rebellion against the Roman Empire, who was then occupying the land of Israel. So this was a few decades after the Romans destroyed the Holy Temple, and Bar Kokhba was the one who created a movement and a rebellion to fight back and reclaim Jerusalem. And he was such a powerful, influential figure that the great sages of the time, not all of them, but many of them, including Rabbi Akiva, who was the most preeminent sage of that time, threw his support behind Bar Kokhba. It's very fascinating. A great sage put his support behind somebody who did not actually end up turning out to be the Mashiach. Let's read text 19. Dr. Lee, would you like to read? Text 19, page 222. Dr. Lee, you got to unmute. There you go.
Rabbi Akiva was a phenomenal sage among the great sages of the Mishnaic era. He personally served as King Bar Kosiba's arms bearer and would proclaim that Bar Kosiba was the King Messiah. Along with all the sages of his generation, he considered Bar Kosiba to be the King Messiah until Bar Kosiba was killed because of sins.
All right, so the campaign ended with a failure. He didn't turn out to be the Mashiach. He got killed by the Romans. Here's a little video going through a little bit of the story of Bar Kokhba. Here we go.
From its inception, the Jewish nation lived with a messianic vision. Even in the worst of times, the Jews anticipated the rise of their star, a savior from the tribe of Judah who would liberate them from foreign subservience and enable religious freedom. 2,000 years ago, Rome stretched forth its mighty branches. In 6 of the Common Era, Judea, the heart of the Jewish homeland, became a Roman province. A few decades later, in the wake of the Great Jewish Revolt, the Romans destroyed the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. That marked the onset of the Jewish nation's exile and persecution. At the same time, the Jews could now anticipate their liberation through the promised Jewish Messiah. In 117 CE, Hadrian became Roman emperor. He toured the empire, erecting pagan temples and promoting Roman beliefs. When he reached ruined Jerusalem in the year 130, he ordered the city plowed over and rebuilt as a Roman city named Aelia Capitolina, with a temple to Jupiter, the chief Roman deity, erected on the site of the Holy Temple on the Temple Mount. This was more than the Jews could take, and in 132 CE, a major revolt began unlike any other. The rebels assaulted the Roman garrison stationed in Judea and succeeded in capturing and holding part of the territory. As Jews from the diaspora flocked to join the cause, Hadrian responded by sending massive reinforcements from Syria, Egypt, and Arabia, but these were similarly defeated. Rome was badly shaken. Hadrian realized the need to muster a truly enormous army in response. He summoned legions from across the globe, including his best general, Julius Severus, who was ordered to travel from Britain with 3 European legions, and units were dispatched from as far as the Danube. Nearly 1/3 of the colossal Roman army was redirected to counter the Jewish revolt. The Jewish army was led by Bar Kokhba, about whom we know precious little.
The name Bar Kokhba wasn't really the man's name. We actually know his name was Shimon Bar Kosiba. But he was called Bar Kokhba because of a biblical verse in the book of Numbers, Darach Kochav Yaakov v'kam Shevet Yisrael, that a star will come forth from Jacob and a staff will arise from Israel. And this verse was understood to refer to the Messiah. As far as we know, many Jews believed that Bar Kokhba was indeed the Messiah and that they were supporting the coming of the Messiah in participating in the revolt.
Such views were reinforced by Bar Kokhba's military gains and his liberation of Jerusalem.
What's really amazing is that during the period of Bar Kokhba's rule, he put out coins. On the back side of some of these coins was actually the words Elazar HaKohen, Elazar, the high priest, apparently. And this may indicate that they tried to restart sacrifices.
Despite Bar Kokhba's widespread support, the Jewish sages were sharply divided on whether Bar Kokhba was the Messiah.
There were different views among the very important rabbis that we know from the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva was convinced that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. The Jerusalem Talmud actually records him as saying, "This is the King Messiah." At the same time, Others, like Yochanan ben Torta, were convinced that he couldn't possibly be the Messiah. And he told Rabbi Akiva that grass will be growing on your nose, meaning you'll be in the grave before this guy will ever be a Messiah.
Eventually, the tide turned. The legions launched a campaign of systematic annihilation that left Judea almost entirely depopulated. The Roman historian Dio Cassius writes, very few of them in fact survived. 50 of their most important outposts and 985 of their villages were razed to the ground. 580,000 men were slain in the various raids and battles, and the number of those that perished by famine, disease, and fire were past finding out. Bar Kokhba withdrew into the fortress town of Beitar. It was besieged and fell in 135 CE, ending the revolt. Its occupants were slaughtered in an enormous massacre on the 9th of Aleph, the date in the Hebrew calendar on which the first and second temple had been destroyed. Bar Kokhba died there, and Hadrian bitterly oppressed the Jews and the Jewish practice in retaliation.
Some years ago, I was at a scholarly conference about the Bar Kokhba revolt, and an Israeli archaeologist mentioned they had actually already located over 500 of these villages. I imagine that by now, he probably found a lot more. So here we see that these events really occurred, and that this war and this tragedy was as great as we find in our sources.
In the ensuing 2 millennia of Jewish exile, the Jews, unlike the Romans, survived and thrived, returned and rebuilt, and continue to eagerly await the fulfillment of God's promise of redemption.
All right. So that's the story of Bar Kokhba. And you should know, I remember when I was 14 years old, I was in Israel, and we went to the caves. They know where it is in southern Israel, the Bar Kokhba caves, where they hid and where they fought from. You could go into the caves. Many of them were already collapsed, but many of them are still. You could literally go and see where they held this rebellion from. One of the places in Israel. The idea is that Rabbi Akiva threw his support behind this Bar Kokhba. So the question is, it's a famous question, could it really be that Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest sages of the time, and one of the central pillars of even the transmission of Judaism till the modern age, could he have made a colossal mistake? Did he just fall for some charismatic charlatan? And the answer is that no, Rabbi Akiva was not mistaken at all. He identified in Rabbi Akiva identified in Bar Kokhba all of the qualities, all the criteria to prove that this person could be the potential Mashiach, the presumed Mashiach, and therefore he supported him. Now, at the end of the day, it didn't work out, right? He didn't actually end up being the confirmed Mashiach, so he wasn't. But the idea was that it was fully legitimate as a presumed Mashiach, and that's the idea. It was not like any of the other false Mashiachs that came later on in Jewish history. We'll talk about one of those in a moment. Rather, Bar Kokhba did check off all the boxes to be a presumed Mashiach. So Bar Kokhba was not a false Mashiach. He was a failed Mashiach, right? Very big difference. But he potentially did pass muster, and he could have been the real deal. And it was totally appropriate for Rabbi Akiva to put his support behind him. But then there's another individual, and we'll conclude the class talking about him, of much more modern example. There's an individual named Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi lived in the 17th century, was born in the year 1622 in Turkey. And at a very young age, just 26 years old, in the year 1648, he announced himself as a Mashiach, as a Messiah. He was a very talented, charismatic individual, history tells us. He also knew a lot of Torah. He was a very talented person. And there was a very large following in him being Mashiach. And I need to give you some background to understand the historical context. The very same year that he announced himself as a Mashiach, the Jewish community in Europe went through arguably the most devastating blow to Jewish Europe, even pre-Holocaust. And this was the pogroms. It's called the Helminski Pogroms in the years 1648 and 1649. There's an individual, his name was Bogdan Helminski, and he was a general. He was a Cossack general. And he led an army of Cossacks that swept through Poland, the old Polish Empire. The Polish Empire then was massive. It included modern-day Germany and Austria and Lithuania in the north and Russia. This is where all the Jews were. Jews lived in Poland. And he swept through the entire Jewish community of Poland in 2 years, from south to north, and just wiped out communities. I heard once that there were only 50,000 Jews left in Poland, down from over 2 million after his pogrom. Historians say that it was a bigger blow to the Jewish people than the Holocaust. So as much as we can just imagine how traumatic and how devastating the Holocaust was to us, we should just know it was not as bad. The effects of it, the trauma of it, just simply the destruction that it did to the Jews on every level, practically, loss of life, structurally, morally, it destroyed the Jewish people. That's 1648, 1649. I'm saying there was not a single family that wasn't spared, and more than that, I once heard somebody share this. I think it was very brilliant. I once heard a historian say there's a silver lining in the Holocaust. The silver lining is that as soon as it was over, everybody left. Essentially, everybody turned over a new page. Right? There's a new chapter being written. We went to Israel, we went to America, we went to South America, we went somewhere. We left Europe. Nobody went back to live in the shtetl. It was done. There's nowhere to go back into Poland. So everybody left. And that allowed people to heal. That allowed people to move on. By the Helminski Pogroms, everybody stayed there. So the very earth that swallowed the blood of Jewish people, it kept on living right there. And in that sense, the trauma never left the people. For years and decades, they're living in the shadow of these pogroms. It was paralyzing for the Jewish people. And right then shows up this message that there's a Messiah out of Turkey. There's this guy named Shabtai Tzvi, and people really like him. And this gave the Jews of Europe their last string of hope. You know, after all the suffering, we have a little bit of something to hold on to. It was that ray of light in that deep darkness. And it became a euphoria. The Jews held on, clinged on to this belief that this guy could really save us. You know, this is our salvation from our troubles. And Shabtai Tzvi was going around for 2 decades, 20 years, saying that he's the Mashiach, and he was traveling around the Ottoman Empire of the time, you know, in Turkey and in Egypt and in Israel. The only problem is that the Jews were so desperate for help that nobody cared to look into what's happening. Shabtai Tzvi never passed the test. This guy was never a real Mashiach. Most importantly, the number 2 requirement for someone to be a real Mashiach is you got to be a pious person. You have to believe in Torah. You have to keep Torah. There has to be a certain piousness and a commitment. And Shabtai Tzvi never had that. He was changing Torah. He was saying these laws don't apply anymore. He was making up his own Judaism. And he was a little bit, now we look back and we say that he had some type of he had mental problems. He had mood swings, very severe mood swings. But this is something that we look back and we can kind of, to some degree, diagnose him. But he was definitely not a stable person. And he was kind of making up his own Judaism. He was a very wild individual, but he was very charismatic. For that reason, most rabbis denounced him. But the problem is, how much information could you really get from Turkey to Europe, to Poland? So there was not a lot of information, and the Jews bought into it hook, line, and sinker. This guy's Mashiach, we believe in him. The problem is, this whole campaign for his being Mashiach ended in a most spectacularly tragic way. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire arrested Shabtai Tzvi because he was becoming such an influential person. And the Sultan told him, either convert to Islam or we're going to kill you. And guess what Shabtai Tzvi did? He converted to Islam. So this guy that the whole world was rooting for him, this is our Jewish Messiah, converted to Islam. the Jews were in such denial that they kept on believing in him. They tried coming up with all types of rationalizations why the Messiah has to convert temporarily, something nobody knew. But it took a few years, and it sunk in that this guy is not a Mashiach. And you can just imagine the Jews were desperate for some hope. They had nothing left after the pogroms. This guy shows up, claims to be Mashiach, and then he's also comes out to be just a crook, an imposter. And this was like a double punch in the gut for the Jews. And after this horrible chapter of Jewish history, we look back that era of Jewish history, that the 50 years after the pogroms of 1648, 1649, we talk about that as the time when the Jewish people were in a state of faint, like in a coma. When somebody faints, they're technically alive, but there's nothing alive about them, right? Yeah, you're still alive, but there's nothing alive about you. You could look in Jewish history, those 50 years, approximately, after the pogroms, after the failure of Shabtai Tzvi, for the next 50 years, there's nothing happening in Jewish history. Can you imagine 50 years, just the world is dead? Jews were technically alive, but it was horrible. The Jewish people have never been at such a low place. No inspiration, no life, nothing. And that was when the Baal Shem Tov, the holy Baal Shem Tov, came on the scene, and he was the gift of God to revive the Jewish people, to bring back hope and inspiration and enthusiasm with the beginning of the Hasidic movement. But the lesson over here is that we have a very practical legal framework to identify who the real Mashiach is. And as long as we stick to that framework, all will be good. But God willing, will indeed soon, one day we'll be able to, very soon, all be able to look and identify who's the real Mashiach, who's that next great Jewish leader. You know, it's not too unbelievable to believe it. We've always had great Jewish leaders who showed up, and really special people have proven their devotion and dedication to the Jewish people. And there's no reason to assume that we are not going to have that again very soon. And when we have that, God willing, we'll be able to identify him as a Mashiach, if it's the real deal. And God willing, maybe speedily in our days. And with that, we conclude today's class. And next week, we'll again keep on going through the very basic. Next, we're going to focus on what's the world going to look like, all the practicals. What does a messianic world look like? We'll go through all those topics from the classical sources. So thank you so much for joining. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
See you all next week.